The night my father called me worthless. I was the one secretly keeping his entire company alive. He didn't know that when he stood on that stage, smiling proudly in front of 200 guests. He didn't know when the room laughed at his joke about his uneducated daughter. And he definitely didn't know that the business he was celebrating that night depended on a company he desperately needed, a company owned by someone he had thrown away years ago. Me. But I didn't correct him. I didn't interrupt. I simply raised my glass, smiled politely, and said something that confused everyone in the room. Enjoy tonight. It's the last time you'll ever see me here. Because the truth was already in motion. And once it arrived, nothing in his world would ever be the same again. Before I tell you how everything unfolded, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who should have supported you the most? If that's ever happened to you, write "they were wrong" in the comments. I read them, and stories like yours deserve to be heard. And if you enjoy powerful stories about people who rise in silence and prove everyone wrong, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You never know which story might remind someone of their own strength. Now let me tell you how the man who called me useless ended up discovering I was the one holding his empire together. My name is Elena Carter, and I was born into a family where success had a very specific definition. It meant power, money, legacy. And in my father's world, those things were reserved for one person. His son. From the outside, our family looked perfect. My father, Daniel Carter, was a powerful name in the logistics industry. His company managed distribution networks across several states, moving thousands of shipments every single day. In business circles, people described him as disciplined, visionary, unstoppable. Inside our home, however, admiration worked differently. It was selective. I was the quiet daughter. The one who preferred reading business articles instead of attending charity events. The one who listened carefully when adults talked about operations, investments, and contracts. I was curious. Observant. But none of that seemed to matter. The only person who truly saw me was my grandmother, Rose Carter. Sometimes she would find me sitting at the kitchen table late at night with a notebook, sketching ideas about how companies worked. One evening she sat beside me, watching silently for a moment before saying something that stayed with me for years. "You notice things other people ignore," she told me gently. "That's a rare kind of intelligence." At the time, I thought it was just a kind compliment. But as I grew older, a pattern inside our family became impossible to ignore. Praise always moved in one direction. Toward my older stepbrother, Lucas Bennett. And my father never tried to hide it. In his mind, the future of the Carter Empire was already decided. The only thing he never considered was what might happen if the person he ignored learned how to build her own empire instead. The imbalance in our family didn't start overnight. It grew slowly, like a crack spreading through glass. When I was 8 years old, my mother died after a sudden illness. Her absence changed the atmosphere in our house almost immediately. The warmth disappeared. Conversations became shorter. My father buried himself deeper into his company, and for a while, it felt like we were all just surviving inside the same walls. A year later, he remarried. Her name was Vanessa Bennett. She arrived polished, confident, and perfectly aware of the influence she was about to gain. With her came her teenage son, Lucas Bennett, who was already 2 years older than me and carried himself with the kind of entitlement that only grows in environments where someone constantly reminds you that you are special. At first, I tried to believe we could become a real family. But small things began revealing the truth. At dinner, my father asked Lucas about his grades, his ambitions, his plans for the future. When I tried to speak, the conversation quietly moved on. When Lucas made mistakes, they were called learning experiences. When I succeeded at something, it was barely acknowledged. Vanessa reinforced it subtly, always praising Lucas just a little louder, just a little longer. And my father listened. By the time I turned 16, the hierarchy inside our home was obvious. Lucas wasn't just my stepbrother. He was my father's chosen successor. And I was simply the extra chair at the table. What I didn't realize yet was how far they were willing to go to prove it. The first real injustice didn't look dramatic. In fact, if you had watched it from the outside, you might have missed it completely. By the time I was 18, I had become obsessed with understanding how businesses actually worked. While other students were choosing majors based on trends or expectations, I had already decided on operations management and logistics. It fascinated me. The hidden systems behind everything people used every day. I studied constantly. Not because anyone pushed me to, but because I genuinely loved it. And for the first time in my life, my effort produced something undeniable. I was accepted into a top university with excellent grades and strong recommendations. Even better, I received a partial scholarship. I remember sitting at the dinner table that evening, holding the acceptance letter in my hands, hoping, just once, that my father would look proud. He glanced at the paper for less than 5 seconds. "That's fine," he said flatly. Then he turned toward Lucas. Lucas had just been accepted into an expensive private business program across the country. Suddenly the room came alive. My father asked about dorms, tuition, internships. Vanessa smiled like she had been waiting for this moment for years. My news had already been forgotten. I told myself it didn't matter. At least I was going to college. What I didn't know yet was that my father had already made another decision about my future. And this time, it would cost me everything. 2 years later, my father called what he described as a family meeting. That alone was unusual. In our house, decisions were normally announced, not discussed. We gathered in the dining room on a quiet Sunday evening. My father sat at the head of the table, Vanessa beside him, Lucas leaning back in his chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who already knew how the conversation would end. I had just finished my second year at the university. My grades were excellent. My professors had even started recommending internship opportunities. For the first time, I felt like I was building something real. My father folded his hands on the table. "I've reviewed the family finances," he said calmly. Something about his tone made my stomach tighten. Supporting 2 students in higher education is more expensive than I anticipated. Vanessa nodded sympathetically, as if she had rehearsed the gesture. Then my father looked directly at me. "So we've made a decision." Lucas remained silent, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly. My father continued. "We can't afford to keep paying for your tuition." The words didn't feel real at first. "I have a scholarship," I said quietly. "The remaining tuition isn't that high." My father shook his head. "Lucas has been accepted into an international MBA preparation program. It's an investment in the future of the company." Vanessa placed a hand on Lucas's arm proudly. And just like that, my future was traded for his. What hurt the most wasn't the decision. It was the realization that it had never really been a choice at all. I tried to stay calm that night. At first, I believed there had to be some misunderstanding. My father's company generated millions every year. The idea that he suddenly couldn't afford the remaining portion of my tuition made no logical sense. So I asked the question carefully. "Is the company having financial problems?" My father's expression hardened immediately. "This isn't a discussion, Elena." Vanessa sighed softly, the way people do when they pretend to feel sorry for you. "Sometimes families have to make practical choices," she said gently. "Lucas's program will open much bigger doors." Lucas didn't even bother pretending. He leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, as if this outcome had always been obvious. "You're smart," he said with a small shrug. "You'll figure something else out." In that moment, something inside me cracked. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Because the truth suddenly became impossible to ignore. There was no financial crisis. No difficult sacrifice. My father simply believed his son was worth the investment. And his daughter wasn't. 3 weeks later, I packed my belongings into 2 suitcases. I left the house with $2,000, no degree, and no real plan. No one tried to stop me. But as the taxi pulled away from the house I had grown up in, one thought kept repeating in my mind. If they believed I was worthless, I would make sure the world proved them wrong. Alone in a new city, I had nothing but $2,000, a backpack, and a stubborn determination to survive. The first few weeks were brutal. I slept in a small, cramped apartment, worked long hours as an administrative assistant, and spent nights teaching myself everything I could about logistics and operations. Every rejection email reminded me of my father's words. Every glance of doubt from coworkers echoed the laughter he had expected. But I refused to cry, refused to beg, refused to surrender. I found solace in the quiet rhythm of work and study. Books, online courses, and late-night research became my world. I observed patterns, noticed inefficiencies, and imagined solutions. Slowly, the pieces of knowledge my father had dismissed as trivial began to form something powerful. And through the exhaustion, a silent promise took root in my mind: one day, they would see. They would understand that their useless daughter was building something no one could ignore. But at that moment, the city felt enormous, my pockets felt empty, and the world felt indifferent. Could I really rise from nothing, alone? Years passed, and every small success became fuel for my quiet strategy. I wasn't seeking revenge yet. Revenge required patience, precision, and planning. First, I needed a foundation. I started consulting small businesses in logistics, learning how supply chains could be optimized, how operations could run like clockwork, and how to spot opportunities no one else noticed. I kept my identity hidden. No one knew my last name. No one knew I came from the very family that had abandoned me. This invisibility became my greatest advantage. I could observe, learn, and build without interference. Some nights, doubt crept in. Could I truly rise above the family that had humiliated me? Could I turn their rejection into power? Every setback became a lesson, every challenge a test. I realized something important: the best victories weren't loud. They weren't immediate. They were deliberate. And in the quiet, I made a decision: I would create something so strong, so essential, that when the world discovered my identity, nothing, and no one, would be able to deny my value. But the first step of that plan required more than knowledge. It required patience. And patience is a quiet weapon. By the time I turned 28, my small consultancy had grown into a company of 15 employees, generating millions in revenue. Every client I took on, every efficiency I implemented, every system I perfected was another layer of invisible power. But power in the shadows can feel fragile. I constantly analyzed my competitors, my clients, even my own instincts. Every decision had to be precise. One misstep could expose me, or worse, bring my father back into my orbit too soon. At night, I replayed the past in my mind: the dismissive glance at the university acceptance letter, the laughter at family dinners, the smug assurance in Lucas's eyes. I didn't feel anger the way people expect. I felt calculation, observation, strategy. I began mapping connections in my father's business world. Patterns emerged. Weak points, dependencies, unseen opportunities. And somewhere deep down, a quiet thrill settled in my chest. The people who had underestimated me thought they had won. They had no idea the game had only just begun. Could they survive the consequences when I finally revealed my hand? I watched them from afar. Not with bitterness, but with curiosity. How did Richard run his empire without noticing the cracks? How did Lucas navigate his father's praise as if it were earned, not given? How did Vanessa manipulate every conversation to make herself indispensable? I studied every move, every decision, every subtle power play. My invisibility allowed me to see what no one else could: the vulnerabilities beneath their confidence. At the same time, I kept growing my own company quietly, taking on projects that no one realized would intersect with their world. My operations improved, my client base expanded, and my expertise became indispensable, though no one knew it yet. It was a delicate balance: remain unnoticed, learn everything, and prepare for the moment the scales could tip. Every day I asked myself, when the time comes, will I strike too soon? Or will patience, as I had always believed, be the true weapon? And in that silence, I realized the real power isn't in confrontation. It's in waiting until they are powerless without you. The first move of my plan came quietly. No dramatic confrontation, no warning. Just a contract. By chance, or fate, my company was hired as a logistics consultant by a firm that happened to be my father's corporation. He had no idea who I was. To him, it was just another vendor, another service provider. I accepted the contract without hesitation. Every analysis, every efficiency tweak, every process improvement was calculated to maximize impact. I was invisible, yet indispensable. Within months, the company's efficiency increased by 40%. Operations that had stumbled for years suddenly ran like clockwork. No one suspected the truth. The praise went to managers, to systems, to Lucas, to my father. I remained behind the scenes, silent, patient, untouchable. It was intoxicating, not revenge yet, but the first taste of control. And each day, I asked myself, when the time comes to reveal who I really am, will they even be able to survive the truth? For now, the world still believed I was powerless. And I intended to let them believe it, just a little while longer. Then came the complication I hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, a mid-level manager in my father's company began asking unusually detailed questions about the processes I had implemented. He wasn't suspicious, just curious, but curiosity can spread. Soon, other executives were noticing the improvements and asking about the mystery consultant behind the changes. I felt a flicker of anxiety. My identity was my shield. If they discovered I was Richard Carter's daughter too early, the balance of power could collapse. Every advantage I had meticulously built could vanish overnight. So I tightened my control. I instructed my team to communicate only through official channels, never revealing personal details. I created alternate billing names, layered contracts, and ensured every trace of my involvement appeared professional and anonymous. Even Lucas began to mention the consultant in passing during meetings. I imagined his smug smile, unaware that the person improving his empire was the one he had long dismissed as worthless. I reminded myself, this wasn't just about ego. It was strategy. Patience. Precision. The question that lingered in my mind each night was simple but terrifying. Could I maintain secrecy long enough for the final reveal, or would my carefully built empire expose me too soon? To continue the plan, I had to make sacrifices. I declined personal opportunities that could have accelerated my public recognition. I turned down speaking engagements, awards, and networking events that might reveal my identity. Every social connection I ignored was a calculated move to remain invisible. I even declined a lucrative contract that risked associating my name with my father's network. Some nights, exhaustion and loneliness crept in. Watching others rise while I remained in the shadows felt like a cruel irony. But I reminded myself, power earned in haste is fragile, power earned in silence is unshakable. I also had to let go of my resentment, not because I forgave them, but because resentment could cloud judgment. Each thought of Richard, Vanessa, or Lucas was turned into a mental map, their weaknesses, patterns, and predictable decisions. Every insult and slight became data. And quietly, I nurtured one private satisfaction: they had no idea the person keeping their empire alive was the very daughter they had dismissed. Patience was my greatest weapon. But even as I sacrificed comfort and recognition, I knew one truth: the moment of revelation was approaching. And when it came, nothing could undo the consequences. Would they recognize me in time, or would it be too late to save themselves? The final move began on a morning that seemed ordinary. I drafted the letters carefully. One was formal, ending the consulting contract with my father's company. The other was personal, a confession, a revelation, a truth they had refused to see for years. I revealed everything, that the company behind their newfound efficiency was mine. That every improvement, every gain, every success had been orchestrated by the daughter they deemed worthless. That I had built it from scratch, alone, without their support. I even mentioned the secret fund my grandmother had left me, quietly correcting a crime my father had committed decades ago. I scheduled the delivery for maximum impact, after the retirement celebration, when the family would feel secure, arrogant, and untouchable. The letters sent, I watched silently as Richard, Vanessa, and Lucas remained oblivious, celebrating what they believed was their triumph. I allowed them to feel invincible for just a little longer. Because invisibility isn't weakness. It's strategy. And the trap I had set was now closing around them. When they discovered the truth, it would be too late. Their empire relied on mine. Their confidence would crumble, and the very people who had humiliated me would finally see what they had ignored all along. Would they beg for mercy, or finally understand the cost of underestimating me? The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Richard, Vanessa, and Lucas first tried disbelief. Emails were opened, letters read, eyes widened, hands trembled. The formal contract cancellation alone was shocking, but the personal letter revealed everything they had refused to see, the truth about the fund my grandmother had left, the years of meticulous work I had done in the shadows, and the fact that their company's newfound efficiency, 40% of it, depended entirely on me. Richard's face went pale. Lucas stammered, anger and panic warring in his expression. Vanessa's carefully constructed confidence cracked, replaced by fear. They rushed to my office, trying to negotiate, manipulate, beg. Richard's apologies were hollow, motivated only by desperation. Lucas accused me of vengeance. Vanessa attempted emotional manipulation, offering sympathy and appeals to family loyalty. I stayed calm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't justify myself. I simply said, "This isn't revenge. This is business. I built everything without you. You relied on me without knowing it. Now the contract ends. You are free to leave." And when they finally understood the weight of their hubris, I added quietly, "I don't hate you. I just don't need you anymore." For the first time in decades, the power shifted entirely. The invisible daughter was no longer invisible. Would they ever forgive themselves, or even comprehend what they had lost? After the confrontation, the dust settled, but the consequences were devastating for them. Richard's company, stripped of the vital improvements I had implemented, began to unravel. Efficiency plummeted, deadlines were missed, and within months, 20% of their staff had to be let go. Lucas, unprepared and arrogant, failed miserably as acting CEO. Vanessa, once confident and controlling, disappeared into irrelevance. Their reputation in the business community crumbled as whispers spread. They had humiliated the very person keeping their empire afloat. For me, life shifted entirely, but quietly. My company thrived, attracting new contracts, independent clients, and recognition I had never sought in my father's shadow. I invested in my growth, therapy healed decades of unspoken pain, strategy sharpened my mind, and I reconnected with my aunt and uncle, learning more about my mother's legacy and the sacrifices she had made for me. I visited my grandmother's grave often, whispering thanks for believing in me when no one else did. The realization settled deep within me, I had never needed revenge. Truth and success were enough. The girl my father called worthless now lived on her own terms, strong, free, and unstoppable. The value of a person, I had learned, is not defined by the family who doubts you, the diploma you hold, or the opinions of those who underestimate you. It is measured by what you build when the world turns its back. And in that truth, I finally understood my power and my freedom. If this story inspired you, take a moment to like the video, it helps more people hear it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to believe in you? I read every single one, and your story matters. And if you want to see more powerful stories of resilience, strategy, and quiet victories, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment.